This is BrainSTEM with your host, neuroscientist Dr. Hilary Marusak, production by Amanpreet Manmeet Bhogal. All right, welcome to our special episode on air pollution. I'm very excited to have today's guest on the podcast, Dr. Clara Zundel, who's actually a postdoc in the lab. So very excited to have you, Clara. Can you first start by just introducing yourself?
Sure. So I'm Clara Zundel. I'm a Postdoctoral Research Fellow, and I'm a behavioral neuroscientist by training, and my research is focused on environmental health and psychiatry.
Awesome, and we'll get all into that today. And unfortunately, it's a kind of timely topic today. We've got in the Northeast and in Michigan where we're located, we've had some wildfire smoke from Canada. So we're all experiencing increases in air pollution. And I'm actually talking to you a week after July 4th, and I always think of the fireworks and all the particulate matter that's put into the air. So your research topic is very timely. So can you first start by just describing what you mean by air pollution and what are the components of that?
Sure. So air pollution is a complex mixture of both gases like ozone and nitrogen oxides, and also particulates, which are found commonly in like dust, soot, or smoke.
Awesome. And what are the different sources of air pollution? Where does it come from?
Yeah, so big sources of air pollution are coal-burning power plants or factories. A lot of air pollution comes from vehicle emissions as well. And then more recently, one of the major pollutants out here in our community in Detroit was the wildfires from Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've all experienced that in our faces, unfortunately. So are there regions or communities that tend to be more affected by air pollution and in the health outcomes? And we'll get into the health outcomes shortly.
Yeah, so urban areas like major cities tend to have much higher levels of air pollution, and that's mainly due to the higher population in those areas. And so there's more demand for energy, so power plants and industry factories tend to be around those areas. And there's more people, so there's a lot more vehicles in the area as well. And then because it's a city, there are less trees and less green space available to kind of combat that air pollution as well.
Mm-hmm. And one surprising aspect of air pollution or source that I never think of is just mowing your lawn.
Right.
So maybe talk about that for a minute. Surprising sources of air pollution.
Yeah, so personal activities that we do in our daily lives can definitely contribute to our own exposure of air pollution as well as just the levels in the air. And so mowing your lawn with a gas lawnmower definitely contributes to that. And so, and even if you're at a party with a big bonfire, you're inhaling those particles from the smoke as well.
Right. And when we experienced that wildfire smoke from Canada, it actually smelled like a bonfire. So I think a lot of people kind of resonated with that.
Exactly.
Kind of interesting. But I always think about air pollution and its effects on the lungs because you're breathing in, like you said, that particulate matter. And that could be affiliated with things like asthma or breathing problems like wheezing, which we often hear about. But your research is really fascinating because you focus on the brain, which is an aspect that we don't often think about. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so recent research is starting to show, just like you said, that air pollution does affect beyond the respiratory system and actually can affect the central nervous system. And so there are really two main ways that can happen. And the first is directly. So small particles in air pollution can enter your nasal tract, travel through your olfactory bulb, and directly impact your brain. And once they're in the brain, they can cause a host of issues, mainly immune and inflammatory responses. And then the second way that air pollution can affect your brain is indirectly. So those particles can go inside your respiratory system, get stuck in your lungs, cause systemic inflammation, which then can travel back up and also adversely impact your brain.
Mm-hmm. And going through the nose too. So if you're wearing a mask, it's important that also covers the nose, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense. Also kind of scary, right? So are there periods in the lifespan, like maybe earlier in life or later in life, that people are more sensitive to the effects on the brain?
Certainly. So there's a lot of research right now that's being conducted to try and figure out or nail down what are those critical windows of exposure. But for really right now, what we can say is that anytime the brain is sort of in this malleable state is when toxins seem to have the most impact. So what I mean by malleable is, for example, during childhood and adolescence, when the brain is going through rapid development, rapid changes, we would expect air pollution to have a big impact during that time. And then similarly, during normal aging, when the brain is starting to show signs of atrophy, we would also expect air pollution to have an impact during that time as well.
That makes total sense when the brain is rapidly developing or changing in some ways. And can you talk about what atrophy means, or just describe that term for viewers or listeners who might not know?
Sure, yeah. So atrophy refers to when cells die in the brain and the brain regions start to shrink or decrease over time, which is it's in normal aging, as well as other like dementia diseases like Alzheimer's.
Right, things to look forward to, right?
Right.
We'll do an episode on aging at some point, but that makes total sense. So you were talking earlier about how you had a pregnant friend who was outside when we were experiencing the wildfire smoke. So what would you suggest for people when they're experiencing things like that?
Yeah, so I would suggest limit outdoor activities. I mean, it's hard to not want to be outside, especially in the summer when air pollution tends to be worse. But I would wear a mask most of the time when you're doing outdoor activities when the air pollution is really bad, and not just any mask, a mask that can trap particles, so something like an N or a K95. And I would, try to limit going outside when the air pollution is really bad, and stay inside where there's more ventilation, better filters. Yeah,
and I think we're all used to those masks from COVID, so just repurpose those.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so the idea that you brought up of your research and how air pollution affects the brain is kind of new in terms of psychiatry, which is the area that we work in. That the fact that your environment can actually change your brain and maybe change your risk for different mental disorders or brain disorders. And it's just interesting to me that where you live or what you're exposed to can actually affect those things, because I think traditionally, we always think of if you have a family history of depression or something, then you're more likely. But actually aspects in your environment can shape that. And you've done a ton of work, not only in children, but in other types of populations, like veteran populations. So I'd just love to hear from you what you were finding in those groups.
Yeah, so my graduate work was conducted within a cohort of Gulf War veterans. And this veteran group is really unique in that during their service deployment, they were exposed to a host of different environmental toxins, mostly pesticides and pesticide mixtures, chemical warfare, so things like sarin nerve gas, and combustion byproducts like air pollution from oil well fires. And so what was really compelling to me during my graduate work was that we were able to see residual health effects of these exposures nearly 30 years after they happened. So these toxins have the ability to create lifelong chronic health effects. And so it's really important that we try to characterize what these health effects are, trying to figure out the mechanisms behind that so we can probably create more treatments and better interventions.
Yeah, that's so crazy to think that something that happened 30 years ago could be affecting your health now. But it just goes to show that even if you don't have like kind of acute symptoms or in the moment of being exposed, it could affect you in 20 or 30 years. So that's really really fascinating and also kind of scary.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, did you find like cumulative effects, like it was like more exposure over time that really mattered, or is it like a one-off exposure that could really enhance your risk? What were you finding there?
Yeah, so in that population was more of about the mixtures of exposure. So they were exposed to a bunch of different toxins all together at the same time for a brief period of time, like 1 year during deployment.
Okay.
And so what a bunch of those different exposures can interact and cause like cumulative health effects on the body. So
yeah, and it seems like we're still learning a lot about this area. So if you're, if you go to a fireworks show or if you're sitting around a bonfire, are you at risk for some of these issues? I know in that work it was a little bit different, but what would you suggest?
Right. Yeah. So we don't know right now what an acute exposure can lead to 30 years down the line, but that's what we're working on investigating. But I would be mindful of the exposures that you are experiencing. So if you're at a bonfire, maybe step like 10 feet away so that you're not ingesting the smoke as much as you would if you were right next to it. And probably wear a mask if you feel like you are right next to the bonfire, just to protect those particles from entering your brain.
Yeah, that's hard to roast s'mores when you're far away.
Yeah, that's true.
But I get it. That makes total sense. So you alluded to some of the stuff that you're working on now, and you've even got research going on this weekend. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing right now with air pollution and brain development?
Sure. So I have a study right now where we're looking at adolescent exposure to particulate matter that's smaller than 2.5 microns or PM 2.5. And so I'm looking at how brief exposure during the adolescent period, so anytime between ages 10 to 17, how that impacts brain development in a way that would increase risk for developing anxiety disorders either in adolescence or later in life. And so there are two main ways that we're looking at air pollution right now. One way is using like fancy statistical models, which are great, and they incorporate air monitors that are on the ground in local communities and incorporate weather and traffic data to predict what an individual's exposure is based on their residential address. And it's really great because we can look back their entire lifetime and really see what is their lifetime exposure, or what was their exposure during the prenatal period or during childhood. But one of the limiting factors of using those models is that not everyone stays at their residential address 100% of the time. We travel to work, we travel to school, and we do personal activities like mowing your lawn that increase our exposure at certain times. And so that's why we've started using these portable air monitors, which are small devices that individuals can clip on their backpack or their pants and wear around with them, so we can kind of get a better idea of what their personalized individual exposure is like.
Yeah, that's great. So we kind of get it in both ways, and you can kind of track, like you said, what activities are maybe associated with an increase in air pollution exposure versus not. That's awesome. And I love the idea of like equipping people with their own personal air monitors, because I check my phone for the air quality index, but like you said, that's such a broad exposure, and if you're outside, that's one thing, but maybe day-to-day activities, that's not really your exposure. So it kind of gets into this idea that I know you've talked about before of being a citizen scientist and kind of equipping people with the ability to measure their own exposures. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so like you said, I would check the weather quality or the air quality using weather apps. Most smartphone apps now have air quality metrics within them, which is really great. So when you check the weather every day before you go outside, just add to check the air quality that day to see if you maybe need to limit your outdoor time or you need to wear a mask outside. I really like using the EPA's Air Now app, which is really great. It gives the same air metrics as like your weather app does, but also includes a forecast, so you can kind of plan ahead for tomorrow. What is the air pollution like? You can see what the primary pollutant is. Is it particles or is it ozone? If it's particles, maybe I would choose to wear a mask when I was outside versus ozone. And so I think, the best kind of citizen is an informed citizen. So anytime that you can try and learn more about the air quality in your community, how to prevent exposures from happening, the better you'll be.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And you kind of already got into my next question, which is how do people protect themselves? And I think, like you said, the first step is really just measuring and informing yourself. I want to ask about the ozone, because you said ozone, you don't wear a mask. So how would you protect yourself against ozone?
For ozone, I would recommend just staying indoors.
Okay.
Limiting outdoor activities is best for ozone. The reason I say, you don't necessarily need to wear a mask with ozone is because ozone doesn't have particles necessarily in it. And so the mask really traps the particles. It won't trap like just ozone in the air.
Gotcha.
So for ozone, I would definitely limit outdoor activities, limit any activities that would contribute to air pollution. So that's why when there's an ozone action day, we don't go and get gas. We don't try and take road trips, those kinds of things.
Got it. That makes total sense. What are other ways that people can protect themselves? Like I'm imagining if you have a personal air monitor or if you have any way of measuring that, and you can measure what's inside your home, like if you have a lot of air pollution within your home, are there things that people can do or in their schools or any other place that they visit?
Yeah, so if you have an air monitor, for example, I have one and I've used it inside my older Detroit apartment, and I found that the ventilation is not very good. So during poor air quality days, the air pollution inside my apartment was actually quite high, and that's just due to poor ventilation or poor filters or old filters. And so one of the things you could do is change your filters regularly. You can also buy a portable air filter to put inside your apartment to help clean the air. If you know that, like, for example, my apartment has high air pollution during that time, I decided to work from the office that day, which I know has really good filters and ventilation and is better for my health. And so with those kinds of things, you can kind of change how you're living your daily life to limit your exposures.
That makes total sense. And a lot of those air filters are relatively inexpensive. So I think there's a lot of different options. That's great. And would you suggest people keep it, like if they had to only have one filter, would you want it like next to their bed while sleeping, or where would be a good place?
That's a really good question. I would probably put it in any space that you are in most of the time. So for example, overnight, I would put it in your bedroom to make sure that you're breathing clean air during that time.
That makes sense, yeah. Okay, so you alluded to some of the indoor exposures, that it's possible to actually have air pollutants within your home. We've been mostly talking about outdoor air pollution at this point, but gas stoves have really come under question in the past couple months. So can you talk about that and what that contributes?
Yeah, so gas stoves, recently there's been a bunch of different studies that have shown that gas stoves emit a ton of nitrogen dioxide into the environment. And so if you're cooking, let's say you're roasting a turkey on Thanksgiving and you have your gas oven on for 6 hours, that will contribute a lot of nitrogen dioxide into your environment. And so if you have a gas oven or a gas stove, we would recommend like opening the windows while you're cooking to get good ventilation, get that air flowing, get it out of the way. But most of the research so far has shown that gas stoves are associated with respiratory outcomes, mostly in children, so things like asthma. But I would assume, same with outdoor air pollution, that indoor air pollution would also impact the brain. We just haven't researched that yet.
Right. Yeah. And this is kind of an aside, but I've also heard about like secondhand smoke exposure or even third-hand smoke exposure. Like if you buy a house and someone had smoked in it previously. So is that a factor that you'd think about? Yeah,
definitely. Again, I would probably think about changing the filters in the house to prevent any residual smoke from just circulating back in the air. Doing as much as you can to kind of limit that exposure.
Right. Yeah. All about harm reduction, I would say. So what are you most excited about in this line of work and in your research in general?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to dig deeper into the mechanisms of this exposure. So trying to figure out what exactly is happening in the brain once those toxins get in there that lead to these changes in brain function and behavior that we're observing. And so based off of that, we're leaning more towards neural inflammation as probably the main mechanism. And so I'm excited to try and look into creating new and better treatments based off of that. So maybe we can use anti-inflammatory medications to kind of combat any of that increased inflammation right after an exposure to try and prevent these chronic health conditions from developing.
Yeah, and we'll do a whole episode on inflammation shortly too, so we'll get more into that. But I think that's really interesting because a lot of what you're describing is kind of out of your own hands. Like you can try to control your indoor exposures as much as you can and wear a mask, but outdoor exposures beyond policy level implications, which we'll talk about in a minute. I think there's if there's things that you can still do to try to protect yourself, I think that would be really important. So I'm excited to hear more about that. We'll have to have you back on in a couple years. Yeah. What resources would you recommend for someone who wants to hear more about what you do or about the research in this area?
Yeah, so I would recommend going to our lab, WSU Think Labs, Twitter and Instagram. We post a bunch of our research results on there from our studies and how to, volunteer for our studies if you're interested and live in the Metro Detroit area.
Shameless plug.
Yeah. And then, like I said, I would probably just download that Air Now app for individuals who are interested in what their air quality looks like in their communities. That's a great resource to have.
Those are great. Yeah, I think the app you said is really, really helpful as well. And we talked about this before, but one of the best ways to really contribute to this research and to really help people and move the needle forward is to volunteer for research.
Absolutely.
And that goes for any type of research. And we'll talk about that again, I'm sure. But that's one way that people can contribute, and you actually get paid for a lot of research studies, so that's a benefit. So lastly, we talked a little bit about what people can do personally, but I want to hear if there's any other ways that they can advocate for like policy changes or ways to reduce air pollution.
Right. So one of the things is to get involved in your community, right? First, research what is the air quality like in your community? Do you have power plants or factories that are in your local communities? And if so, most of those places have to apply for an air permit to be able to release pollutants into the air. And a lot of those things require public comments or comments from the community about whether or not they should be able to do that. And that's one instance where folks from the community can speak up to try and limit their exposure. Some other things you can do are attend city council meetings and advocate for maybe carpool lanes so that we have less vehicles on the road, less vehicle emissions in the air. They can advocate for more green space, more trees, because trees actually clean the air. So the more trees we plant, the better the air quality will eventually become. and really just advocate for, better air quality in their communities however they can.
That's wonderful. And I think there's dozens of examples of people doing exactly that, where, in Detroit, we have the big Ambassador Bridge that goes over to Canada, and trucks were basically lining up and idling their trucks adjacent to where people are living. So they're really sucking up that exhaust. And they raise their voice about it, and hopefully things will change. And then another example is something that I didn't think about was kids who are being dropped off from school, or when they enter their school buses. All the school buses tend to idle. And in Michigan, it's probably because it's so freaking cold that they need to keep the heat on. But they didn't think about the kids who are sitting there, basically ingesting all of that air pollution. So a lot of people have raised their voice, and they've done like anti-idling campaigns for their local schools. So I think those are just great examples of that. But yeah, do you have any other examples or any last words you want to share with us?
I don't think so. I would encourage folks to incorporate air quality metrics into their everyday lives before they go outside, before they plan their personal activities. It's just good to be informed and aware before you make decisions about your personal health.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Zundel. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That wraps up another episode of the BrainSTEM podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and share this with friends and family, and be sure to follow us on social media at BrainSTEM Podcast.